I'm going to talk about the 10 best books on money. Unfortunately, if you read books on monetary theory, it doesn't enable you to make money. I think there's a story that Karl Marx's mother once said that she thought it was unfortunate that Karl wrote so much about capital instead of making some. Now, the first book I want to mention is one by an economist who is very different in his views from Karl Marx. It's one that Walter just talked about in his talk. It's the one by Murray Rothbard, What Has Government Done to Our Money? This is a very short book. I think it originally came out as a pamphlet with the Freedom School of Robert Lefebvre. And I think the primary thesis of Murray Rothbard's book is some people have an idea that money is purely conventional. They'll say, well, why do we accept these pieces of paper in exchange? Well, we accept them because we know everybody else will accept them. For example, the philosopher John Searle, who's a very good philosopher of language but not so good on money, says exactly that. But according to Murray Rothbard, this is a completely false picture of money. Money, in his view, must begin and ought always to be strictly a commodity. And he points out that originally the names for money were simply designated units of weight. For example, a British pound, the British pound before World War I, was defined as 113 grains of gold. So according to, as Rothbard says, well, money must be, if the economy is to work properly, must be a commodity. Now, a problem comes in, this is again something Walter was discussing, is it's very often people find inconvenient just to carry around, say, bars of gold, so they have the idea of having certificates where they'll be, instead of having to actually carry the gold, they'll just have certificates representing the money. So the problem comes in if you have more of these certificates than actual money available, and this generates allows government to inflate the currency, and it'll lead to business cycles and have all sorts of bad things. And Murray, in the book, gives just a few pages capsule summary of monetary history, showing the bad effects of not maintaining money strictly as a commodity. Now, I just want to move on to a book that's quite a bit more difficult than What Has Government Done to Our Money? This is the book by Ludwig von Mises. It originally came out in 1912, of course in German, called A Theory of Money and Credit. This is undoubtedly the greatest of all books on monetary theory. Mises, in that book, solved a big problem for monetary theory that economists had never been able previously to solve. And the problem is this: in the subjective theory of value, which is the one that Austrian economics uses, the prices of goods are explained by the subjective values that consumers put on them. Say, if you say, why does an apple have a certain price? It's because consumers value an apple so much on their preference scale compared with other things. But the problem seems to be that one German economist, Karl Helfrich, pointed this out. He said the problem is that if you ask, well, what's the value of money, that depends on what the prices of all the other goods are. So there seems to be, if you try to have a subjective theory of money, you seem to be engaging in a circle. You'd say, well, the value of the price of money depends on the value consumers assign it, but the value of money in turn depends on the prices. So this was the problem economists couldn't solve, but Mises figured out a way to solve it. I won't go through his solutions, famous money regression theorem. You'll be able to see that in the in the book. Now, Mises, in that theory of money and credit, develops also, at least the beginning stages of a theory of the business cycle that was dependent on expansion of bank credit. And he applies this theory in a volume called you can get all the causes of economic crisis. And this Mises, in 1928, was able to foresee that there would be a crisis coming. He was able to see that if the inflationary policy of the 1920s continued, there was going to be a depression. A lot of other economists, such as the great American economist Irving Fisher, were saying, no, we reached permanent prosperity. But Mises said, look, if you have the government expanding the money supply, you have an increase in bank credit, this is going to generate all sorts of problems. And he also, in this book, there's an essay he has just called Cause of the Economic Crisis. It was a lecture I think he gave in 1931. And he asked the question, well, why is this crisis more severe than past depressions? And he points out that the governments are interfering in the economy in various ways. For example, they're propping up wage rates. They're not allowing wage rates to fall, and this is leading to unemployment. Now, as I said, Mises relied on the theory of the business cycle that he started to develop in theory of money and credit, but probably the most elaborate account of the Austrian business cycle theory, or the best account, is in the book called Prices and Production by Friedrich Hayek. This you can get, a very good edition that's just come out, edited by Joe Salerno, Price and Production and Other Works. And Hayek, in that book, elaborates in detail on the mechanism by which the Austrian theory develops. What you have is, if the bank expands credit, this will lower the monetary rate of interest below what's called the natural rate of interest. According to the Austrian theory, natural rate of interest depends on the rate of time preference, the rate by which people prefer present goods over future goods. So if there's an increase in bank credit, then businesses will tend to take the money and they'll expand their businesses. In particular, they'll invest more heavily in capital goods industry. Hayek calls this an expansion. They'll expand the production of these capital goods industry, but they'll expand the structure of production. Then, after the monetary expansion stops, then they'll most probably be returned to the true rate of interest dependent on, which is determined by time preference, and then it'll be found out that these businesses are not good investments. They'll have to be all liquidated, and this is precisely the depression. It's the liquidation of all these businesses. Now, one thing you find in the book by Hayek, particularly with the additional works that Joe Salerno has included, is Hayek was quite deadly in his replies to critics. He was really a very tough critic. If you think, say, some of my reviews in Mises' review were bad, you should see what he said. It reminded me when I was reading, particularly, say, he had an essay criticizing Frank Knight on Capital. It reminded me of a comment the American critic Dwight MacDonald made when he was reviewing a book that it was a military manual on during World War II by Colonel Rex Applegate called "Kill or Get Killed," and MacDonald said the thesis of this book could be summarized: always kick below the belt, especially when the other man is down. So this is what Hayek is like when he takes after some opponent of his theory. He's an extremely good critic. Now, a later book that I want to mention is also on the Austrian theory of the business cycle is one by the Spanish economist Jesus Huerta de Soto, and this is called Money, Bank Credit, and Economic Cycles. And what de Soto is particularly good at replying to the monetarists such as Milton Friedman, and he makes a comment, which I think very interesting in the book. He says that he thinks that compared to the Austrian theory, there isn't really that much difference between monetarists and Keynesians. Of course, in mainstream economics, the monetarists and Keynesians are very strongly opposed to each other. But he says, well, compared to the Austrians, you can really put them in the same category. And now he also, besides being an economist, he's a expert on legal theory, and he points out, he devotes a great deal of attention in the beginning of the book to a criticism of the legal basis of fractional reserve banking. You remember from Walter Block's talk, fractional reserve banking is the system in which a bank doesn't have to have gold or other commodity money backing up all of the demand deposits that it has. It could issue credit beyond this. It has certain minimum reserve requirements, but it can issue credit beyond this. So Huerta de Soto says it's been impossible for lawyers really to come up with a good way of characterizing how the situation would be described legally. He said, you can't really say it's a loan contract, because in a genuine loan contract, while you have the money, say, that you borrowed, you can do whatever you want with it for that period. Say, if I borrowed $500 from you for 6 months, you can't come back to me, say, after 2 months, say, I want the money. For that period alone, I can do whatever I want with it. Of course, if you loan the money to me for 6 months, you wouldn't get it back in 6 months either. But that's a side point. So he said, well, we can't call it a genuine loan contract, but because the people in a demand deposit, you can get your money back whenever you want. So he said, well, we can't really characterize this in any acceptable form. And he goes on to describe all sorts of ways people try to get around this point, but they haven't been able to do it. Now, I mentioned a few books on the Austrian business cycle theory, but I now want to turn to an application of that theory to a historical event. It's the American Great Depression, and this is I want to mention the great book of Murray Rothbard, originally came out in 1963, called America's Great Depression. Now, what Rothbard does in the start of the book, he gives a very good account of Austrian business cycle theory. He stresses and compares it with all sorts of other popular theories of the business cycle. And he says the Austrian theory is the one that's able to explain, as the other theories can't, the key thing that business cycle theory has to account for. There's what he calls a cluster of entrepreneurial errors. Why is it that a lot of businesses are failing all at once? And he says, well, the reason for this is that just this process I mentioned before, that there's been an expansion of the bank credit that distorts the structure of production. So then when businesses find that the true rate of interest won't sustain their products, there's a liquidation of these unsound investments. And he applies this to explaining the great 1929 depression. He says there's been there was a Federal Reserve during the 1920s under the especially as determined by the most prominent person in the system, the governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, Benjamin Strong, was inflating the money supply. In doing so, the reason that they were doing that, they were acting in conjunction with the the head of the Bank of England, Montague Norman, who wanted the other countries to inflate so he could this would help the British pound. So Murray Rothbard says that American policy was really subservient to English interests. Now, there's an objection that people might give, and monetarists such as Milton Friedman, given this, they said, well, look, if you look at the 1920s, there wasn't a big increase in prices, so how can you say that the 1920, the Federal Reserve policy was following an inflationist policy if prices didn't go up? But here what you would have to do is say, well, what would have happened had they not expanded the money supply, and prices would have fallen. So you see, there was actually, it isn't the fact that prices weren't rising so much in the 20s doesn't contradict Rothbard's account, because prices would otherwise have gone down. And then later on in the book, he goes on to explain along similar lines to what Mises had done in this 1931 talk I gave. I mentioned that he says the policies that the government, especially under Herbert Hoover's administration, established in propping up wage rates, interfering in the economy, prolonged the Depression, made it much worse than it otherwise would have been. I think Rothbard's work can be here especially in the international aspect, be very usefully supplemented by another book that came out, I think, in 1972 by Melchior Paley called Twilight of Gold. This was actually brought out after he died a couple years before, but his wife brought it out. Paley was a Hungarian who taught in Germany for a long time. He was the chief economist of the Deutsche Bank until I think he left in March 1933, right after Hitler had come to power in January. And he was also a disciple of the great German sociologist Max Weber, and in fact edited Max Weber's Festschrift. So what Paley points out, again, continuing a theme that Rothbard had mentioned, he stresses the influence of Montague Norman on monetary policy after World War I. He contrasts Montague Norman with Lord Keynes. At that time, he wasn't Lord Keynes. He's just John Maynard Keynes. He said Norman wanted to try to restore the British, before returning to the full gold standard, he wanted to restore the British economy to a stronger position, but he did eventually want to return to the full gold standard, but he said Keynes didn't. Keynes was a full-fledged economic nationalist, and he didn't really want an international system based on the gold standard. And Paley is very critical of Milton Friedman and the monetarists, and he says that Milton Friedman has an unduly narrow view of the monetary supply in the 1920s. If you had a longer view, a better view, you would see there was inflation in this period. In one point, he differs with Rothbard. He thinks that the British could have restored the pre-war parity. When they restored the pre-war parity of the gold standard, he said it wasn't a bad thing to do. Rothbard said they shouldn't have done that, but he thinks they should. Now, one theme that Paley mentions is, this is taken up by the next book that I want to mention, is Jacques Rueff, The Monetary Sin of the West, is there's a very big difference between the classical gold standard and the system that was put in the 1920s, and which was called, after the Genoa Conference in 1922, the gold exchange standard. Now, in the classical gold standard, is the great British philosopher David Hume first explained, there's a very strict limit on how much inflation the government can perpetrate, because if it increases the supply of money, then prices will go up, and there's a mechanism by which it'll lose gold. But in the gold exchange standard, it's just one or two countries in the actual exchange. It was America and Britain had money that was backed by gold, and all the others had money that was, I think, was based on the British pound. The British pound was also could pyramid on American dollars. It was a rather complicated system. This allowed much more inflation. And Rueff, oh, I see I'm running out of time, so I'll have to race through the other books. Rueff applies this criticism of the gold exchange language. He says he thinks the gold exchange system marked the beginning and the end of Western civilization. So he applies this also to monetary policy in the 1950s and 60s. So I want to finish up just in a minute left to me with two works of historical importance. One came out in 1875 by great British economist William Stanley Jevons. And Jevons was really the one who developed first these requirements for a commodity to be money, such as being a store of value that Walter was mentioning. And one point Jevons makes in the book, he's rather critical of fractional reserve. He says on minimum reserve requirements, where he said the bank has to have a certain amount of money and then it can just expand credit. He says, well, this is like telling a spendthrift that you should keep a shilling in your pocket to make sure you don't overspend. Always keep a shilling in your pocket. Wouldn't be very good advice. And the last book I want to mention is one by Edwin Cannon called Money, came out in 1918. Cannon was one of the first ones to popularize the idea, which we take for granted now, that there's the reason prices go up is that the government expanded the money supply. Before Cannon, a lot of people thought, well, money supply increase is just a response to price increase, but Cannon said no. It's this: if the money supply causes increasing prices, if you don't want prices to go up, you shouldn't expand the money supply. And he was very critical of British policy in World War I for doing that. Well, I think so. Those are the 10 books. If you read those, I think you'll have at least a beginning of a good grasp on monetary theory. Thanks very much.